America Online was a big thing when I was 13. In other words, for my generation, AIM, which stood for, you guessed it, AOL, Instant Messenger. It was around 2002, and I would have been a fresh 13-year-old in 8th grade. I had many times that I went into the chat rooms by myself, or with friends goofing around. Unfortunately, unsolicited photos were a thing. They would happen a lot too often, and it was usually too hard to stay clear of them by the chat room you entered. I didn't have any photos of myself back when you had to take a digital photo and upload it from your camera. Plus, I was 13 and self-conscious, which I'm sure anyone can relate with. But one day, a guy popped up on my screen, wanting to chat. I went fine at first. I was very naive back then, and we quickly fell into a pattern of talking. His name was Dave, and he lived in California. Eventually, he started telling me that he loved me, but the problem was, he was 19. Now, I wasn't proud of this at first, but being 13, I just sent him pictures of a random girl and said it was me. He instantly fell for me and started telling me that age is just a number, and I was very mature. Now, at this point, I did not live in the States, so there was definitely no chance of us meeting. Eventually, he told me he and his mom were moving up to the city that was about an hour and a half away from me. He started begging me to see him and to go to a movie with him, or just anything. I had to break the catfishing truth and say those were not pictures of me, but of someone else. He was furious. He had been looking forward to a different type of child this whole time. Dave forgave me a few days later, saying, I still want to meet you because I love you. All the things you can say to a young girl to get her to swoon. I think back and I'm like, wow, I was only 13 at this time. So I told my best friend everything, and I just explained what I said above and that I want to go see him and meet him. There was a whole plan about him driving to see me and going to see the movies to finally meet what I thought was the love of my life. I had been brainwashed into believing this was normal. I didn't tell my mom, of course, and honestly, she didn't notice any of it going on to begin with. So, the day my friend and I were going to meet up with Dave, her mom came to pick us up from school. She said something that made my stomach drop into nothingness. She said, Chrissy, you're not going to the movies. You're not going to meet that man. You're gonna get seriously hurt or kidnapped. I can't allow you guys to go. I cried, because honestly, I thought I could handle everything and it would just be fine. She told me she wasn't gonna tell my mom. I had to promise to never speak to him again and never plan to meet a stranger online. He ended up showing up and was upset I wasn't there. He went on AIM and started blowing my computer up. He was furious. It scared me. It scared me how close I was to this man being near to me. I never talked to Dave again, but I easily believe that I would have been kidnapped or worse that day if my best friend's mom hadn't stepped in. My mom would have been none the wiser. I was none the wiser. But since that day, I learned a dire lesson. I'm mostly a lurker on here, but I considered sharing my story several times. I was hesitant because absolutely no one knows about this, not my family, nor my friends. I've held on to it for 10 years now, and I figure it's time I let it out. Plus, I think there's some valuable lessons that can be learned from my experience. Here we go. Caution, it's a very long story. For reference, I'm a 27-year-old female, and this story takes place 10 years ago when I was 17. I had just started university and was excited about having a fresh new start since I've always been a nerdy outcast in high school. I had never had a boyfriend before, nor had I ever been on a date, so I was naive and optimistic about boys. My introverted and awkward personality hadn't really magically changed since entering university, so it's safe to say that I didn't meet any interesting guys at school. One late night, I was in my room working on an assignment on my laptop when I received a request on SMN Messenger. The email address was a boy's name with some numbers. The name was clearly ethnic and likely someone of the same origin as me. Intrigued, I accepted it. For the sake of the story, we'll call the boy Ken. We got to chatting and I asked him how he had gotten my email address. He dodged that question. I let it go, not thinking too much of it. This was from a time when it was normal to accept anyone and everyone as a friend on Facebook and other social media platforms. As Ken and I continued to talk, I learned that he lived in my city and apparently wasn't much older than me. As I had guessed, our roots were in fact from the same country. Let's call it Motherland. I asked him why he didn't have any pictures of himself on his display picture, and this prompted him to suggest that we turn on our webcams because he wanted to see me too. I declined, but he insisted. Somehow, he convinced me. We both switched our webcams on. I was pleasantly surprised and somewhat relieved to see that Ken was a good-looking young guy, chatting to me from the comfort of his bedroom, seemingly normal. Our MSN chats carried on for a couple of weeks. They developed into text, and we even had a few phone calls after I had agreed to give him my number. I started to develop a crush on Ken. He'd asked me to go out with him a couple of times, but I was always pretty busy with school, and our schedules weren't really lining up at the time. Finally, we found one afternoon where we were both free and decided to schedule a lunch date. Ken had a car and offered to pick me up from my university after I was done for the day. I was too dressed up for my C++ programming class, but just right for a lunch date. We had planned to go to a local vegetarian restaurant. Stupidly, I didn't tell any of my friends where I was going or whom I'd be with because I was embarrassed about going on my very first date at almost age 18 with someone that randomly messaged me on MSN. I waited outside the building when a black car with heavily tinted windows pulled up beside me. The passenger side window rolled down, and sure enough, it was Ken, sitting in the driver's seat. I was happy to see that he was as cute in person as he was on webcam. However, what I wasn't expecting was the intense smell of weed floating out of the car. Not relevant, but part of the first impression. Admittedly, I was a bit taken aback and was concerned that he might be driving while high. He unlocked the doors and motioned for me to get in, so I did, without dispute. As I sat down in the passenger seat, and he immediately put his hand on my thigh, I nervously shifted my leg away. "So," I started, "do you know where the restaurant is? I can guide you if you want." He smirked at me, but didn't say anything, and just started driving. Okay, kinda weird, I thought. Maybe he was just nervous or awkward, both of which I could sympathize with, so I just let it be. I was about to try my hand at making some small talk, which I'm not good at, when I noticed him heading towards the highway ramp. I started to worry, because the restaurant was not far from the campus, and there was no reason for us to be getting on the highway. You don't need to take the highway. The restaurant's actually really close by. I can just guide you." I kept trying to make my voice steady, as I said, but I could hear my own nervousness. Ken finally spoke for the first time since I had gotten in the car. "I thought we could go back to my place instead. We can play Need for Speed, and I can make lunch for you." I was 17, on my way to see the house of the guy I'd just met for the first time, and hadn't told anyone where I was going. My mind was racing. I knew that this would be an utterly stupid thing to do. Despite the clear red flags waving in my face, I decided that I didn't want to ruin the first date by rejecting his offer to make me lunch and play Need for Speed together, which I told him I liked playing. Don't judge me. So, like an idiot, I reluctantly agreed to avoid being rude. We finally made it to his house. It was apparently his family's home and was situated in a sorta shady neighborhood. We stepped inside and, of course, no one was home except for us. It was sparsely furnished and looked unkept, which struck me as pretty odd for a family home. He informed me that his Xbox was in his bedroom. I hesitated in the doorway, but he sat at the foot of his bed in front of the TV and patted the empty space beside him to have a seat. There was literally nowhere else to sit in his room, so I cautiously sat down, keeping as much distance as I could between us. I started to relax, and as we played Need for Speed, he had made us some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to munch on. I was about to laugh at myself for being overly paranoid when Ken did something bizarre. He got up onto the bed and sat down directly behind me, his legs on either side of me, an extremely awkward position to be in, and tried to guide my hands on the controller. I started to ask him what he was doing, as if this wasn't uncomfortable enough, and his hands moved from the controller and slid up my shirt. That's when I really started to panic. I thought he was going to try to grope my chest, but instead, he started squeezing and massaging my belly. It was more than a little chubby back then, so you can imagine what it might have been like. I dropped the controller in pure shock and quickly stood up, fixing my shirt. I was at a loss for words, and he did nothing but smirk at me and tell me he liked it. I felt completely disgusted and violated. I had had enough. I lied and told him that I had a group project to work on and that he needed to go. He asked where I live, so he could drop me off at home. Thankfully, I had the common sense not to tell him, and I asked him to take me back to school instead, where I would be supposedly meeting my classmates. He obliged. After our very uncomfortable first date, I decided I didn't want to talk to Ken anymore. I didn't block him on MSN or on my phone, our only two methods of communication, but I rarely responded to his messages and ignored all of his calls. Once, he messaged me on SMN around 11 p.m. asking me to come over and telling me that he would sit a cab to bring me over to his place. Thoroughly annoyed, I just responded with, "What the hell do you take me for? Why do you think I want to do that?" He replied by saying, "No sex, I promise." Just bizarre. I was disgusted and didn't even respond. He continued trying to get in touch with me for months, and then suddenly vanished. I figured he'd finally gotten the point. Now, I wish the story ended here, but it doesn't. I last heard from Ken in late February. He had stopped trying to contact me shortly after Valentine's Day. In April, 2 nuclear family members and I went on a holiday to visit another relative, who we'll call Annie, who wasn't living in the Caribbean at the time. Annie, whom I love dearly, was and still is a bit eccentric. She considers herself very spiritual and an active member of a large, well-known spiritual organization. She is deeply connected with Motherland, more than the rest of us are, and goes back frequently to visit. While we stayed with her in the Caribbean, she told us her most recent spiritual trip to the Motherland, where she met a wealthy, well-connected woman through the organization, who quickly became a very close friend. Let's call her Connie, the con artist. During our visit, Annie introduced us to Connie virtually over Skype, because Connie lives in the Motherland. We chatted with her a couple of times throughout our vacation via Skype, and we got to know her a little bit. Little did we know, back then, that Connie, who Annie had spontaneously met halfway across the world in Motherland, would soon wreak an utter havoc on our lives. Now, that's a story that I'm just not, or maybe never, ready to tell, because of how many lives were affected and the severity of the damage that had been inflicted. What you do need to know is that Connie was an outright criminal and con artist who had been targeting our family long before Annie had actually met her. Their meeting was no coincidence. Not only did she manage to steal over $100,000 from our family, but she also took away any peace of mind or sense of security we ever had. When we finally caught on and confronted her, she insisted we were mistaken, but disappeared into thin air once we forced her out of our lives. You're probably wondering what on earth this has to do with the story about Ken. Well, get this. The situation with Connie lasted many months. The whole thing is kind of a blur to me now, but we first spoke to her online in April, and I remember the whole ordeal lasting into the fall. Well, she normally resided in the Motherland. Annie had invited her to go visit and stay with us, where my whole family and I presently live. That's when things really took a turn for the worse. Some of the things I clearly remember and are important to the story were that, 1. The whole time she was staying with us, she was trying to convince me to transfer schools to a very obscure school and program in the US. I don't even live in the US. She was actually getting very pushy about it. 2. She had asked me if I was a virgin and told me to save myself for my husband. Disturbing, I know. During this time, I was so emotionally drained and stressed that I didn't really think anything of it. In fact, I had stopped socializing almost entirely and even started skipping classes. I had lost contact with my high school friends, and my university friends were too new to really care, so my strange behavior and new destructive habits went unnoticed. Fast forward to one day, after Connie's final disappearance in the fall, I was at home with my dad when my cell phone rang. I looked at the caller ID, and it was a number I didn't have saved. So it was just showing the contact information as whatever the name of the phone registered was. My heart dropped to my stomach. My phone displayed the name. The first name was a man's name, and the last name was the same last name as Connie's. I started to panic, and ran into my bedroom to answer the call. I had no idea what to expect. When I picked up the phone, I was greeted by a familiar voice. It was Ken. I honestly thought I was going to puke everywhere when I came to sudden realization that he had been part of this whole sick plot. Of course, I don't have hard evidence to prove that he was connected to Connie, but let me explain. The timing of his appearance and reappearance into my life, the last name, a fairly unique surname originating from a part of Motherland where Connie is from, and I had never known Ken's last name until then. And the fact that he contacted me out of the blue, and I had no idea why or how, That was just too bizarre to be a mere coincidence. Of course, I freaked out at Ken when he called, and I told him that if he ever called me again, I would call the police. His response was just a weird, dry, half laugh, and then he said, "Well, okay then," in the most creepy voice you can think of, and hung up. I knew in my gut this was their last attempt to get back in touch and somehow slither their way back into mine or my family's lives. Thankfully, I never heard from Ken again after that day. A while after this all ended, I was having a conversation with a family member who was also closely involved in all this about the whole ordeal, and she told me she sensed something extremely wrong with Connie was pushing to have me sent off to the US, to that obscure school she wanted me to go to. She had an unshakable feeling that Connie was involved in some sort of human trafficking scene, and that if I had left, she would never have seen me again. The horrifying pieces came together for me at that time. I was just too damn naive to have seen it before. The memories flooded back to me when I heard that. How Ken had told me, "No sex, I promise," when he invited me over. And how Connie was telling me to remain a virgin. As I said, I had never told a soul about Ken, nor about the weird V-card conversation with Connie. I strongly and firmly believe that Ken had been some sort of player in Connie's game, and was just there to keep me away from guys and prevent me from having a boyfriend. For those who may be wondering, we never called the police on Connie or Ken, because nothing illegal really had happened. It's very hard to explain. I also mentioned that I tried to find Ken online many times after all this ended. I don't know why. I felt like I wanted to expose him or call him out or something. I was not able to find a sliver of information on him. Not by the name Ken, or by the name on the caller ID. It was as if he just didn't exist. Also, I'm awful at directions and don't remember his address or where his house was exactly. I'm sorry if this story is convoluted or confusing. I'm trying to get my point across without giving out any names or too many details, which makes it a bit challenging. I also hope this can serve as a warning to young people to never trust anyone, to always check on people, especially those you meet online, and to be very aware and wary of people's intentions. Also, from the incident onward, I can't stomach a lot of these spiritual organizations. I never liked the idea of them to begin with, but now I've truly experienced how they can attract both vulnerable people and also unsavory characters who are looking for someone vulnerable to prey on. No judgment for those who are in that sort of thing, it just definitely is not for me. I would like to hear what you guys think about this. Do you think my suspicions are plausible? What do you make of this? Keep safe, everyone. And to Ken and Connie, if that's even your real names, if I ever see either of you again, I'll kick you in the face. Rot in hell. Edit 1. I didn't think so much people would be interested to see which country these scammers came from. This is a throwaway, so whatever. For all of you who said India, you are correct. Edit 2. Part of the purpose of sharing this experience is to help alert others to potential dangers like these. I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't release this information. The spiritual organization was Art of the Living, and this wasn't my first bad experience with them. Edit 3. I see AOL getting a lot of attention here, and I think I would like to be more clear and provide some information. Connie was not an AOL leader, representative, or anything like that. She seemed like a participant/lingerer who was just there under the false guise of wealthy, well-connected woman. As I mentioned, I've no doubt that these types of shady characters flock to places like AOL, looking for easy targets, but I'm not sure if it speaks to the organization itself. I'm not by any means saying that AOL was involved in this potential human trafficking scheme. Way back in the year 2000, I was a bored 15-year-old girl and began exploring AOL chat rooms. I had recently left public school and moved to a new city that I had never more than passed through, so I was a bit lonely. I thought it would be cool if I could link up with some people around my age in the new area. I've always been very curious with my personal information, so wasn't too worried about anything bad happening. I ended up meeting my boyfriend through one of the chat rooms. Things moved quickly, and I was soon to be pregnant and engaged. We got our own place. Life was good. We still used AMI to message each other when he was at work, and frequently, we would also chat with our friends in the chat rooms. Some of my old online contacts would message me from time to time, but honestly, I mainly chatted with people I knew in real life. When our son was about 6 months old, we moved into a larger apartment. My fiance, Jake, began working long shifts, so I was home alone a lot with the baby. One evening, I was in a chat with a friend when someone else sent me a IM. I wasn't sure who it was, but she began chatting with me and it seemed remotely normal at first. I was still confused as to who it was, and so she sent me a photo. She didn't look familiar. I continued the conversation because I started to think maybe my fiance and a friend were just messing with me because he liked to joke around like that, but after a little bit of dull, awkward conversation and my refusing to allow them to view my webcam, this person sends me a photo of a random middle-aged man. Confused, I ask who it is and why they sent it. They gave me some line like, "Oh, that's my friend John. Don't you think he's handsome?" Then I immediately knew this wasn't right or a joke from anyone I knew. It was clear that I'd been messaging this guy all along, pretending to be another teenage girl. I initially cut off contact, but after a couple of days of thought, I was just creeped out and actually called and canceled my AOL service. A week or so after this, my brother-in-law, Mark, and his wife Lynn moved in with us. It was an early evening on a Friday, and Mark, Lynn, and I were getting some food and drinks ready before Jake got home. I was in the kitchen, and Mark was just a few feet away from me in the living room with Lynn. We were chatting and laughing when the phone rang. I answered the line in the kitchen, but it was a man, and he greeted me by my first name in a very creepy tone, and seemed to be keeping his voice low. I had a feeling in the pit of my stomach that something was wrong. I asked, "Who is this?" Mark took notice and asked me who it was. He must have noticed some change in my tone, because he glanced at me, then he went straight into his room to pick up the other line and listen. The man on the phone must have heard Mark, because he then said to me, "Well, I see you have company," in a pretty disgruntled tone, and then he quickly hung up. I didn't have caller ID at the time, so I dialed *69 to get the number. When I called it back, it was a hotel in a neighboring city, about 15 minutes away. I asked the clerk who answered about the phone call I had received, but they informed me that there was no way to tell what room it was placed from. I knew it wasn't anyone I knew. My phone line was only active for a couple months at that point, and was listed under my name, but I'd only given it to family and a few close friends. We didn't know who to make of it, and as the night went on, it was forgotten about. The week came and went. I received a couple calls from blocked numbers. I called them back and no one responded. I tried to convince myself that I was simply worrying too much and that it was no big deal. We prepared for another week and hanging out together. Again, Mark, Lynn, and I were home and Jake was still at work. We needed a few things from the store, so Mark volunteered to go get them while Lynn and I stayed in with the kids. Now, the building we lived in had 3 apartments on the lower side by side, and 3 units above the upper level, kind of like a motel. Our unit was the last to the right on the lower level and the furthest from the parking lot. You walk down a cement walkway and past 2 lower apartments where you get to the end of the building. There's an area between the deck staircase to the upper level and the building where a couple bicycles were stored. This is the only residential property in the area, and the surrounding businesses/offices were closed at this time of the evening. Mark exited the apartment but came back running in just a few minutes later. He asked me if I was expecting more company. When I told him no, he told me this. When he began walking past the other apartments and into the lot, a man dressed in dark clothing with a hood on had snuck out of the bicycle area and began walking towards our apartment with his head down. Once he mentioned Mark was coming straight towards him, he turned and ran. Mark chased him into the lot, but the guy took off into the darkness and we lost him. We all just sat there nervously for a few minutes because we were all thinking the same thing. That was the man who called, and that was the girl from the chat room. I just have no clue how he would have gotten my number, unless maybe I'd given it to someone previously, thinking that they were someone else, but it was really him just catfishing me. I don't know how advanced people's hacking skills were back then, and if they could have found my information out through AOL service, but I definitely regretted chatting away my boredom. After this, we moved to a different town, and I never listed a landline number in my name again, and definitely never went back to those chat rooms. So yeah, whoever you were, let's just not meet again.